The knock came at 7:30 on a cold January morning in 2024, the kind of winter dawn where frost clings to windows and your breath turns to vapor the second you step outside. A sheriff's deputy stood on the porch of a modest ranch house in a quiet Missouri neighborhood, his hand raised to knock again, his partner waiting by the patrol car with the engine still running. Inside, a man in his early 60s was probably pouring his first cup of coffee, maybe reading the morning paper, going through the ordinary rituals of another Tuesday. He had no idea his life was about to end as he knew it, that the secrets he'd kept buried for 40 years were about to surface, that the knock on his door was the sound of the past finally catching up. When he opened that door and saw the badges, saw the grim expressions on the deputies' faces, something in his eyes flickered, just for a second. Recognition maybe, or resignation, or the terrible understanding that this day had always been coming. Within minutes he was in handcuffs, being read his rights, being led to the patrol car while neighbors peeked through curtains and whispered to each other in confusion and shock. A respected member of the community, a man who'd lived among them for decades, was being arrested for a murder that happened in 1984, before some of his neighbors were even born. The case of Sophia Johnson, cold for 40 years, had finally been solved, and the arrest would shatter everything this small Missouri town thought it knew about itself. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. The investigation that led to that January morning arrest had been building quietly for months, a convergence of new technology and old evidence, of determined detectives and preserved case files, of science that didn't exist in 1984, finally being applied to questions that had haunted a community for decades. But to understand why this arrest sent shockwaves through central Missouri, why people couldn't believe what they were hearing on the morning news, you have to go back to 1984, back to a time when Ronald Reagan was president and MTV was still new and forensic DNA analysis was just beginning to be developed in research labs. You have to understand who Sophia Johnson was, what her life meant to the people who loved her, and how her death left a wound that never fully healed. Sophia Marie Johnson was 23 years old in the spring of 1984, a young woman on the cusp of real adulthood, still figuring out who she wanted to be but already showing the qualities that made people gravitate toward her. She'd been born in 1961 in a small town about 40 miles outside of St. Thomas. Louis, the youngest of 3 children in a working-class family that believed in church on Sundays and hard work the rest of the week. Her father worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant, her mother was a secretary at the local elementary school, and they raised their kids with the kind of stability that was common in those days, modest but secure, rich in community if not in money. Sophia's older siblings remembered her as the baby of the family who somehow never acted spoiled, who was easy to love because she was genuinely kind, who had a laugh that could fill a room and a way of making you feel like you mattered. Growing up in the 70s and early 80s, Sophia had been a typical small-town Missouri kid. She played on the swings at the park on summer evenings while her parents sat on blankets and talked with neighbors. She'd ridden her bike through streets where everyone knew everyone, where you could leave your doors unlocked and kids could roam until the streetlights came on. She'd been a decent student, not the valedictorian, but solid and reliable, the kind of girl who helped classmates who were struggling and never made anyone feel stupid for asking questions. She'd been popular in the way that kind people often are, not because she was the prettiest or the most outgoing, but because she was genuine, because you could trust her with secrets, because she showed up when she said she would and remembered your birthday and asked about your sick grandmother. After graduating high school in 1979, Sophia had taken classes at the community college while working part-time at a local diner, one of those classic American establishments with vinyl booths and a jukebox and regulars who came in every morning for coffee and eggs. She worked the breakfast and lunch shifts, getting up at 5 a.m. to open the place, greeting farmers and factory workers and retirees by name, knowing their usual orders before they sat down. The owner would later say Sophia was the best waitress he'd ever had, that customers asked for her section specifically, that she could handle the morning rush with grace and efficiency, while somehow making everyone feel like they were getting personal attention. She was saving money, though she wasn't quite sure what for yet, maybe eventually finishing a 4-year degree, maybe traveling somewhere beyond Missouri, maybe just having a cushion for whatever came next. By 1984, Sophia had moved into a small apartment in town, her first place of her own, a 1-bedroom unit in an older building that wasn't fancy, but was hers. Her mother had helped her pick out curtains, and her father had installed deadbolts, and her siblings had given her hand-me-down furniture that didn't match but made the space feel like home. She was still working at the diner, still taking occasional classes, still active in the church youth group, even though at 23 she was starting to age out of that role. She'd been dating someone casually, a guy she'd known from high school who worked construction, nothing too serious but steady enough that people had started asking if they might get engaged eventually. She had friends she met for pizza and movies, a routine that felt comfortable, a life that was simple but hers. People who knew Sophia in those final months of her life would later struggle to articulate what made her special, because her specialness was in the ordinary things, the small kindnesses that don't make headlines but make life bearable. She was the friend who remembered you were nervous about a job interview and called to check how it went. She was the coworker who covered your shift when your kid was sick without making you feel guilty about asking. She was the daughter who stopped by her parents' house on Sunday afternoons, even though she had her own place now, who brought her mother flowers from the grocery store for no particular reason, who sat with her father watching baseball games on TV even though she didn't particularly care about sport tests. She had plans that spring of 1984, vague but hopeful plans, the kind of dreams young people have about their futures being bigger and brighter than their presents. Her family would remember that she'd been talking about maybe taking a trip to Colorado that summer with some girlfriends, that she'd been excited about a concert coming to St. Louis in June, that she'd mentioned wanting to take a photography class at the community college in the fall. Small things, normal things, the building blocks of a life that was supposed to have decades ahead of it. She'd recently bought a new dress for Easter, something floral and spring like that her mother said made her look especially pretty. She'd been teaching herself to play guitar, practicing chords in her apartment until her fingers hurt, dreaming of maybe playing at an open mic night at a local coffee shop. She'd adopted a cat from the shelter, a scruffy orange tabby she'd named Rusty, who slept on her bed and greeted her at the door when she came home from shifts at the diner. The last time Sophia's mother saw her daughter alive was on a Wednesday afternoon in late April 1984. Sophia had stopped by the house after her lunch shift at the diner, still in her uniform, smelling like coffee and bacon, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. They'd sat at the kitchen table and shared a pot of tea and talked about ordinary things, about Sophia's brother's new baby who was colicky and keeping everyone up at night, about the garden Sophia's mother was planning to plant now that the frost danger was passing, about nothing important and ever, a thing important at the same time. When Sophia left that afternoon, she'd hugged her mother like she always did, said love you like she always did, and walked out to her car like she'd done 1,000 times before. Her mother watched from the porch as Sophia backed out of the driveway, waved, and drove away. It was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of goodbye that feels meaningless until it becomes the last one, and then it plays in your mind forever, every detail sharp and painful and precious. That evening, Sophia had plans to meet a friend for dinner at a pizza place in town. Nothing fancy, just two young women catching up and splitting a pie and maybe going to a movie afterward if they felt like it. But Sophia never showed up for dinner. Her friend waited at the restaurant for 30 minutes, figured maybe Sophia had gotten held up at work or had her signals crossed about the time, went ahead and ordered food alone and then headed home, slightly annoyed but not worried. People miss plans sometimes. It happened. She'd call Sophia tomorrow and give her a hard time about standing her up, and they'd laugh about it and reschedule. Except tomorrow came and Sophia's phone rang unanswered, and the day after that, and concern started replacing annoyance. When Sophia didn't show up for her morning shift at the diner on Friday, when the owner called her apartment and got no answer, when he called her parents' house and learned they hadn't heard from her either, that's when concern turned to alarm. Sophia was reliable, unfailingly reliable, the kind of employee who called if she was going to be even 5 minutes late, who'd never missed a shift without notice in all her years working there. Her father drove to her apartment and knocked on the door and heard Rusty the cat crying inside, but got no response from Sophia. The landlord opened the door with his master key and they found the apartment undisturbed, Sophia's bed made, her purse on the counter, but no Sophia. Her car was gone. Her parents called the police, filed a missing person report, and a search began, but in those first 48 hours, nobody really knew what they were looking for, where to start. The answer came 3 days later on a Sunday morning, when the world should have been waking up to church bells and family breakfasts, and instead, a farmer checking fence lines on his property found Sophia's car pulled off onto an old access road that cut through woods and farmland about 12 miles outside of town. The car was empty, keys still in the ignition, driver's side door slightly ajar, and 50 yards into the tree line, hidden from the road by brush and the natural undulation of the land, they found Sophia. She'd been murdered, her life stolen in a place of dirt and trees and silence, left there like she was nothing, like her laugh and her kindness and her dreams didn't matter at all. The news hit the community like a physical blow, the kind of tragedy that makes people lock their doors and question everything they thought they knew about safety and God and fairness. Sophia Johnson, the girl who'd served them breakfast with a smile, who'd sung in the church choir, who'd never hurt anyone in her 23 years, was gone. And somewhere, walking among them, was the person who'd taken her away. The investigation began immediately, deputies and state police converging on that rural access road where Sophia's car had been found. Crime scene tape cordoning off the area, while forensic technicians photographed and measured and collected evidence with the tools available to them in 1984. The lead detective assigned to the case was a man named Frank Patterson, a veteran of the county sheriff's department who'd worked property crimes and domestic disputes and the occasional bar fight, but never a murder like this, never something that would demand every ounce of skill and determination he possessed. Patterson was in his late 40s, a local guy who'd grown up in these same small towns, who knew the rhythms of rural Missouri life, who understood that when something this terrible happened in the close-knit community, it sent ripples that touched everyone. He stood at the crime scene that Sunday morning, looking at the place where a young woman had died, and made a silent promise that he'd find whoever did this, that Sophia Johnson would get justice. The autopsy revealed that Sophia had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her body showing signs of a violent struggle, evidence that she'd fought her attacker even though she'd ultimately lost that fight. The medical examiner estimated she'd been dead for approximately 72 hours, which meant she'd likely been killed on that Wednesday evening when she'd failed to meet her friend for dinner, probably sometime between leaving her mother's house around 4 p.m. and when she was supposed to be at T.T. restaurant at 6:30. 2.5 hours. A window of time when Sophia's life had intersected with evil and ended in those woods. The physical evidence collected from her body and clothing included biological material from her attacker, hair and fiber samples, but in 1984, the science to analyze that evidence in any definitive way simply didn't exist yet. DNA profiling was still being developed in laboratories in England and hadn't been used in any American criminal cases. What detectives had were blood types, hair characteristics under microscopes, and the hope that traditional police work, interviews and alibis and witness statements would lead them to a suspect. Detective Patterson assembled a team and began the painstaking work of reconstructing Sophia's final day. They interviewed her mother, who described that afternoon visit, who provided the timeline of when Sophia had left their house. They talked to neighbors at Sophia's apartment building who confirmed seeing her arrive home around 4:30. Watching her park her car and head inside carrying what looked like takeout from a convenience store. One neighbor remembered hearing Sophia's door close around 5:15, heard footsteps on the stairs, but hadn't looked out to see if it was Sophia leaving or someone else coming or going. The friend Sophia was supposed to meet for dinner gave her statement, describing how unusual it was for Sophia to miss plans without calling, how she'd waited and then eventually left the restaurant assuming there had been some miscommunication. The diner owner and Sophia's co-workers all said the same thing, that Sophia had seemed completely normal at work that day, chatty and friendly and making plans for the weekend, showing no signs of distress or fear or any indication she thought she was in danger. The boyfriend Sophia had been casually dating was interviewed and his alibi checked thoroughly. He'd been at a construction site until 6 p.m. that Wednesday, confirmed by his foreman and multiple co-workers, and had gone home to the apartment he shared with a roommate who verified he'd been there all evening. Patterson looked hard at him anyway because statistically intimate partners are often suspects in these cases, but nothing connected him to the crime scene, and Eve Hundred seemed genuinely devastated by Sophia's death, his grief raw and real in ways that don't typically accompany guilt. Still, his name stayed on the list of people being monitored because thoroughness meant not ruling anyone out prematurely. The discovery of Sophia's car on that remote access road suggested she'd either driven there herself, possibly meeting someone, or had been forced to drive there by her attacker. The keys in the ignition indicated she hadn't planned to stay long, or that she'd been interrupted before she could remove them. Detectives canvassed farms and houses within a 5-mile radius of where the car was found, asking if anyone had seen vehicles on that road Wednesday evening, if anyone had heard anything unusual, if anyone recognized Sophia's photo. Most of the responses were negative. It was farmland, sparsely populated, the kind of place where you could see headlights from a distance but wouldn't necessarily think anything of a car passing by. One farmer thought maybe he'd seen taillights heading down that access road around dusk on Wednesday, but he couldn't be certain of the day or the time, and he definitely hadn't seen the vehicle clearly enough to describe it. The theory that developed was that Sophia had either been abducted from her apartment or from somewhere between her apartment and wherever she'd been heading that evening, forced into her own car and driven to that remote location. The alternative theory was that she'd gone to meet someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to drive to an isolated spot with, and that person had attacked her. Both scenarios were investigated simultaneously, detectives running down every lead no matter how thin. They looked at sex offenders in the area, men with records of violence against women, anyone who'd raised red flags in the community. They interviewed people who frequented the diner where Sophia worked, regular customers who might have developed an unhealthy fixation on the friendly waitress. They talked to classmates from her community college courses, co-workers from previous jobs, anyone who'd intersected with Sophia's life in any meaningful way. The small town rallied around the investigation with the kind of collective outrage and fear that tragedy produces. Vigils were held at the church where Sophia had sung in the choir, hundreds of people gathering to light candles and pray and demand that whoever did this be caught quickly. Sophia's family, devastated beyond measure, made public appeals for information, her mother standing in front of news cameras with tears streaming down her face, begging anyone who knew anything to come forward. Tip lines were established and calls poured in, most of them well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful, people reporting suspicious vehicles or strange men or vague feelings that their neighbor seemed off. Every tip was followed up on, every lead chased down, because you never knew which piece of information might be the one that broke the case open. 3 weeks into the investigation, a potential suspect emerged who seemed promising enough to focus significant resources on. A man in his 30s who lived about 20 miles from where Sophia's body was found, had a history of assault charges, had been fired from a job at a gas station where Sophia occasionally bought cigarettes for her father, and had no solid alibi for the evening Sophia disappeared. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and he was evasive and hostile, refusing to answer certain questions, demanding a lawyer when pressed about his whereabouts that Wednesday. His truck was searched, and they found rope in the bed, work gloves, a knife, all things that could be innocent for someone who did farm work, but could also be sinister given the context. They collected hair samples and blood for typing, comparing them to evidence from the crime scene. The blood type matched, which in 1984 was significant but not definitive since blood types are shared by large percentages of the population. The hair analysis was inconclusive, similar but not identical under microscopic examination. Detective Patterson wanted to believe they'd found their man, that this suspect with his violent history and his evasiveness and his opportunity was the one who had killed Sophia Johnson. But wanting something to be true and proving it were different things, and the evidence just wasn't strong enough. The suspect's lawyer maintained his client's innocence, provided explanations for the items found in his truck, argued that suspicion and circumstance weren't the same as guilt. Without DNA technology to definitively link the biological evidence from Sophia's body to this suspect, without witnesses placing him at the scene, without a confession, the prosecutor declined to file charges. There simply wasn't enough to take to trial with any confidence of conviction. The suspect remained a person of interest, monitored and watched. But eventually he moved away from the area, and the focus on him diminished as other leads developed and faded. Months turned into a year, and the case that had consumed the community's attention began to recede from daily conversation, replaced by new concerns and tragedies, and the simple forward motion of life that continues whether we want it to or not. Detective Patterson never stopped working the case, kept the file on his desk, periodically reviewed evidence and re-interviewed witnesses hoping something new would shake loose. But leads dried up, and the trail grew cold. Sophia's family marked the first anniversary of her death with another vigil. The crowd smaller this time, but the grief no less acute, the sense of injustice burning just as hot, even if public attention had moved on. Her mother placed flowers at the site where Sophia's body had been found, a ritual she'd continue for decades, marking the spot where her daughter's life had ended with seasonal bouquets that would wilt and be replaced over and over, a mother's love manifesting in the only way she had left. The limitations of 1984 forensic science meant that crucial evidence, the biological material that had been carefully collected and preserved, sat in storage waiting for technology that didn't yet exist to make it useful. The hair samples, the fiber evidence, the sexual assault kit, all of it was cataloged and boxed and filed away in the evidence room of the county sheriff's office, meticulously maintained according to protocol, but essentially useless without the scientific capability to extract meaningful informatio from it. Detective Patterson retired in the mid-90s, and on his last day he handed the Sophia Johnson file to a younger detective and said the same thing he'd been saying for over a decade, that this case deserved to be solved, that Sophia deserved justice, that someone out there knew what happened, and someday, somehow, the truth would come out. The case file was passed from detective to detective over the years as personnel changed and retired, and new investigators inherited the cold cases that haunted their department's history. Each one would open the folder, read through the reports, look at the photos of a young woman whose life had been stolen, and feel the weight of unsolved injustice. Some would spend weeks reviewing everything, trying new angles, hoping their fresh eyes might see something previous investigators had missed. But without new evidence or new witnesses or new technology, there was nowhere for the investigation to go. The case sat cold, gathering dust, while Sophia's killer walked free, living whatever life they'd built for themselves, maybe thinking they'd gotten away with it, maybe haunted by what they'd done, maybe not thinking about it at all. The years passed with a weight that Sophia's family carried every single day, a burden that never lightened, no matter how much time accumulated between that terrible April evening in 1984 and the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that continued without her. Sophia's mother aged with the kind of profound grief that changes a person fundamentally, that etches itself into the lines of your face and the slowness of your movements. She kept Sophia's bedroom exactly as it had been, a shrine to a daughter who would be forever 23 while the world moved forward without her. Every April she placed those flowers at the site where Sophia had been found, rain or shine, alone or accompanied by family members who worried about her making that pilgrimage but understood she needed to do it. Sophia's father withdrew into himself, became quieter over the years, his anger at the injustice of an unsolved murder turning inward into a sadness that his remaining children recognized but couldn't penetrate. They'd lost a sister, but their parents had lost something even more fundamental, that basic assumption that the world makes sense, that evil gets punished, that justice exists. Detective Patterson, even in retirement, never fully let go of the case. He'd followed the development of DNA technology with the interest of someone who understood its implications for cold cases, watched as forensic science revolutionized criminal investigations through the 90s and 2000s. He read about cases being solved decades after the crimes were committed, old evidence being re-examined with new tools, and he thought about that evidence room where Sophia's rape kit and the biological samples from her attacker still sat preserved. He made calls to the sheriff's department, gentle nudges to whichever detective currently had the case, suggesting that maybe it was time to look at that evidence again with modern technology. But cold cases competed for limited resources and lab time, and Sophia's case was one among hundreds across Missouri waiting for someone to prioritize it, waiting for funding and attention and the convergence of factors that would finally give it another chance. That convergence began in 2022, when the county received a grant specifically designated for cold case investigations using advanced forensic techniques. A new detective, a woman named Sarah Chen, who transferred to the county sheriff's office from a larger metropolitan department, had experience with forensic genealogy and understood how the explosion of consumer DNA databases had created unprecedented opportunities for solving old crimes. She'd helped crack 2 cold cases in her previous position using genetic genealogy, building family trees from crime scene DNA and triangulating suspects through their relatives who'd voluntarily submitted DNA to ancestry websites. When she arrived at her new position and learned about the backlog of unsolved cases, she requested access to all the files, spending weeks reading through decades of reports and evidence logs, looking for cases that met the criteria for this new investigative approach. The Sophia Johnson case stood out immediately. The evidence had been meticulously preserved according to the standards of 1984, which meant the biological samples, though old, might still be viable for DNA extraction. The case had clear community impact, and a family still desperately seeking answers after nearly 40 years. And crucially, there were no living suspects already identified, which meant genetic genealogy could potentially provide a name that traditional investigation never had. Detective Chen submitted the paperwork to have Sophia's red kit and the preserved biological evidence sent to a specialized laboratory that dealt with degraded DNA samples from cold cases. The wait for results would be months, but it was movement, progress, the first real forward motion the case had seen in decades. The lab work was painstaking and complex. DNA degrades over time, breaks down into fragments that are harder to analyze, and samples from 1984 had been sitting in storage for nearly 40 years despite careful preservation efforts. The forensic scientists worked with microscopic amounts of genetic material, using techniques that could amplify even degraded samples, running tests and retests to build a complete DNA profile. By late 2023, they had success. A full DNA profile of Sophia's attacker was developed, extracted from the evidence that had been waiting all those years for science to catch up. The profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system that contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders and unsolved crime scenes, but there was no hit. Whoever had killed Sophia Johnson had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA submission, or had committed this murder before DNA collection became standard practice and had somehow avoided any subsequent charges. This is where genetic genealogy entered the process, the same technique that had famously identified the Golden State Killer and had been quietly solving cold cases across the country. Detective Chen worked with a genetic genealogist, uploading the killer's DNA profile to GED Match and Family Tree DNA, public databases where people voluntarily upload their DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. The DNA profile didn't match anyone directly, but it showed matches to distant cousins, people who shared small percentages of DNA with Sophia's killer, people who had no idea their innocent hobby of researching ancestry would help solve a murder. The genealogist began the meticulous work of building family trees, tracing back through generations to find common ancestors, then working forward through all the descendants of those ancestors, creating sprawling diagrams of families spread across Missouri and beyond. The process took months of painstaking research, cross-referencing obituaries and marriage records and census data, eliminating branches of the family tree where all the males were too young or too old or had died before 1984. Slowly, the possibilities narrowed, the tree pruning itself through logic and science until a cluster of potential suspects emerged, men of the right age living in or near the area in 1984, men who shared the right amount of DNA with those distant cousins to fit the genetic profile. One name in particular stood out, a man named Robert Mitchell, who'd been 30 years old in 1984, who'd lived just 15 miles from where Sophia's body had been found, who'd still been living in the same general area all these decades later. He'd never been on the radar during the original investigation, had no criminal record, nothing that would have drawn attention to him, but the genetic genealogy pointed to him with increasing specificity as more of his extended family tree was mapped out. Detective Chen began investigating Robert Mitchell's life with the intensity of someone who understood that genetic genealogy provided direction but not proof admissible in court. She needed to either get a direct DNA sample from Mitchell to compare against the crime scene evidence, or she needed to build a circumstantial case strong enough to obtain a search warrant for his DNA. She learned that Mitchell had worked in 1984 at a feed supply store that Sophia's father had occasionally patronized. A tenuous connection, but a connection nonetheless. A place where Mitchell might have seen Sophia when she accompanied her father on errands. Mitchell had married in 1987, had children who were now grown with families of their own, had worked various blue-collar jobs over the decades, and had settled into a quiet retirement in a small house not far from where he'd lived in the 80s. To everyone who knew him, he was unremarkable. A guy who mowed his lawn and attended the occasional town council meeting, and helped his daughter with her kids on weekends. The surveillance began carefully, detectives watching Mitchell's movements, waiting for an opportunity to collect what's called an abandoned DNA sample, something he'd discard in public that would carry his genetic material and could be legally collected without a warrant. They followed him to a diner for breakfast and collected his coffee cup after he left. They watched him buy a soda at a gas station and retrieve the bottle from the trash. The samples were sent to the lab for analysis, and when the results came back, they were definitive. Robert Mitchell's DNA matched the profile developed from Sophia Johnson's rape kit. After 40 years, they'd found him. The man who'd raped and murdered a 23-year-old woman in 1984 had been living a normal life all this time, had raised children and gone to work and slept peacefully while Sophia's family suffered, while her mother placed flowers at the site of her death year after year, while justice waited for science to catch up. The decision to arrest Mitchell was made carefully, prosecutors reviewing every piece of evidence, confirming that the DNA match was solid enough to bring charges after all these decades. In January 2024, on that cold Tuesday morning, deputies knocked on Robert Mitchell's door and ended his freedom. The arrest made immediate news. A 40-year-old cold case solved through genetic genealogy. A respected community member charged with murder. A family finally getting answers they'd waited half a lifetime to receive. Mitchell was arraigned and pleaded not guilty, his attorney arguing that DNA could be contaminated or mishandled over 40 years, that genetic genealogy was junk science, that this was a rush to judgment against an innocent man. But the evidence was overwhelming, and when faced with the reality of the DNA match and the testimony from forensic experts explaining how the science worked, Mitchell eventually changed his plea. In a courtroom packed with people who remembered 1984, who remembered Sophia, who'd lived with this unsolved tragedy as part of their community's history, Robert Mitchell admitted to killing Sophia Johnson. His confession was matter-of-fact, lacking the emotion you'd expect from someone confessing to murder, describing how he'd encountered Sophia that evening, how opportunity and impulse had combined into violence, how he'd thought he'd gotten away with it for so long that he'd stopped worrying about being caught. He showed no real remorse, offered no explanation that made sense of why he'd taken a young woman's life, and that emptiness was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire proceeding. Evil doesn't always have grand motivations or comprehensible reasons. Sometimes it's just selfishness and opportunity and a complete disregard for the humanity of others. Sophia's mother, now in her 80s, attended the sentencing hearing, supported by her surviving children and grandchildren, and when given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement, she spoke with a clarity that comes from decades of grief transformed into determination. She talked about Sophia, about the daughter she'd lost and the woman Sophia should have become, about the grandchildren Sophia should have given her and the life that had been stolen. She looked directly at Robert Mitchell and told him that he'd taken her daughter, but he hadn't broken her family, that Sophia's memory had been honored every day for 40 years and would continue to be honored long after Mitchell died in prison. She thanked the detectives and the scientists who'd never given up, who'd used new technology to finally bring her daughter's killer to justice. And she said something that resonated through the courtroom and would later be quoted in news coverage, that justice delayed is painful, but justice denied would have been unbearable. That knowing the truth even after 40 years mattered. That Sophia finally had her voice back through the evidence he'd left behind. Robert Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a 64-year-old man who'd lived free for 40 years being led away in shackles to spend whatever time he had left behind bars. The community that had been shocked by his arrest gradually processed what it meant that someone they'd known, someone ordinary and unremarkable, had been capable of such evil and had hidden it so successfully for so long. The case became a teaching example in law enforcement circles about the power of preserving evidence even when technology doesn't yet exist to fully analyze it, about never giving up on cold cases, about how genetic genealogy was revolutionizing investigations and giving voices back to victims who'd been silenced for decades. Sophia's grave, in a cemetery not far from the church where she'd sung in the choir, had been visited regularly by her mother for 40 years, flowers placed there in all seasons and all weather. Now those visits carried a different weight, not the desperate grief of unsolved injustice, but the quieter sadness of loss, with acknowledgement of a wrong that had finally been addressed, even if it could never be made right. The case proved that time doesn't erase truth, that evidence waits patiently for science to evolve, that families who refuse to give up can see justice even when it seems impossible. Sophia Johnson was gone, had been gone for 40 years, but through DNA preserved in 1984 and analyzed in 2024, through detective work that spanned generations, through a mother who never stopped demanding answers, her killer was finally held accountable. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let us know. And if this story resonated with you, there are dozens of other cold cases on this channel that deserve attention. Victims who waited years or decades for justice, families who never gave up hope. Sophia's case reminds us that the truth has a way of emerging even from 40 years of silence, that science and determination can combine to give the dead a voice, and that evil, no matter how long it hides, can ultimately be exposed and punished. She was 23 years old with her whole life ahead of her when Robert Mitchell took that future away. But through the evidence she unknowingly left behind, Sophia helped solve her own murder and proved that some debts to justice can never be outrun, only delayed. Her family waited 4 decades, but they got their answers, and Sophia got the last word through DNA that pointed an unwavering finger at the man who tried to get away with murder.